Turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 9. We're continuing on this morning. And as we get into chapter 9 and the first part of chapter 10 this morning, I want to read a couple of passages, not from 1 Samuel, to sort of set the stage and start us off. So Proverbs 16:9 says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." Romans 8:28, as Ben reminded us, all things work together for good for those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. And Philippians 2:12-13 says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." And Proverbs 16:33 says, "The lot falls into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord." Daniel 2:21 says, "He is sovereign over seasons, kings, and wisdom and knowledge." And then in Proverbs 19:21 says, "Man has many plans, but the purposes of the Lord stand." All of these texts together are speaking of the fact that God is sovereign. We see this in Job chapter 1, where Satan comes and approaches God asking to afflict Job, to show that Job would deny God or dishonor God, and God allows this. So Satan meant this for one purpose, God meant it for another. If you're a theology nerd, it's called the doctrine of concurrence, which says that two or more parties can act in the same event and produce a given outcome without both parties having the same intent. I think this is best illustrated in what Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis chapter 50, where he says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." That's concurrence, right? So they meant it for evil. They had evil intentions. They had wicked hearts. They meant it to hurt their brother, but God meant what they did for good. This morning, what we're going to see in this passage is we're going to see 5 points about the sovereignty of our God. And so if you're able, please stand in the honor of the reading of God's word. This is the word of the Lord from 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1 through 10, verse 16. And I apologize in advance for ruining all of these names of towns in Hebrew. I was not good at Hebrew in seminary. "There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Apath, a Benjaminite, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. For his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Now the donkey of Kish, Saul's father, was lost, or the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to Saul his son, 'Take one of the young men with you, and arise and go and look for the donkeys.' And he passed through the hill country of Ephraim and passed through the land of Shalshah, and they did not find them. And so they passed through the land of Shalem, and they were not there. And then they passed through the land of Benjamin and did not find them. When they came to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, 'Come, let us go back, lest my father cease to care about the donkeys and become anxious about us.' But he said to him, 'Behold, there is a man of God in this city, and he is a man who is held in honor. All that he says comes true. Now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way we should go.' Then Saul said to his servant, 'But if we go, what can we bring the man? For the bread in our sacks is gone, and there is no present to bring the man of God. What do we have?' The servant answered Saul again, 'Here I have with me a quarter of a shekel of silver, and I will give it to the man of God and tell us the way. Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he said, 'Come, let us go to the seer, for today's prophet was formerly called a seer.' And Saul said to his servant, 'Well said. Come, let us go.' So they went to the city where the man of God was. As they went up the hill to the city, they met young women coming to draw water and said to them, 'Is a seer here?' And they answered, 'He is. Behold, he is just ahead of you. Hurry. He has come just now to the city because the people have a sacrifice today in the high place. As soon as you enter the city, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. For the people will not eat until he comes, since he must bless the sacrifice. Afterwards, those who are invited will eat. Now go up, for you will meet him immediately.' So they went up to the city. As they were entering the city, they saw Samuel coming out toward them on his way to the high place. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel, tomorrow about this time, I will send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen my people because their cry has come to me. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, here is the man of whom I spoke to you. It is he who shall restrain my people. Then Saul approached Samuel in the gate and said, tell me where's the house of the seer? And Samuel said to Saul, I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for today you shall eat with me, and in the morning I will let you go, and will tell you all that is on your mind. As for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not set your mind on them, for they have been found. And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and for your father's house? Saul answered, am I not a Benjaminite from the least of the tribes of Israel? And is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then have you spoken to me in this way? Then Samuel took Saul and his young men and brought them to the hall and gave them a place at the head of those who had been invited, who were about 30 persons. And Saul said to the cook, bring the portion I gave, of which I said to you, put it aside. So the cook took up the leg and what was on it and set it before Saul. And Samuel said, see, what was kept is set before you. Eat, because it was kept for you until the hour appointed, that you might eat with the guests. So Saul ate with Samuel all that day. And when they came down from the high place into the city, the bed was spread for Saul on the roof, and he lay down to sleep. Then at the break of dawn, Samuel called to Saul on the roof, up, that I may send you on your way. So Saul arose, and both he and Samuel went out into the street. As they were going down to the outskirts of the city, Samuel said to Saul, tell your servant to pass on before us. And when he has passed on, stop here yourself for a while, that I may make known to you the word of God. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you shall save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies. And this shall be the sign that the Lord has anointed you to be prince over his heritage. When you depart from me today, you will meet 2 men by Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin and Zelzah, and they will say to you, the donkeys that you seek are found, and now your father has ceased to care about the donkeys and is anxious about you, saying, what shall I do about my son? Then you shall go from the father to and come to the oak of Tabor. 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you there, one carrying 3 young goats, another carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a skin of wine. And they will greet you and give you 2 loaves of bread, which you shall accept from their hand. After that you shall come to Gilbeath Elohim, where there is garrison of the Philistines. And there, as soon as you come into the city, you will meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place with harp and tambourine, flute and lyre before them, prophesying. Then the Spirit of the Lord will rush upon you, and you will prophesy with them and be turned into another man. Now when these signs meet you, do what your hands finds to do, for God is with you. Then go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I am coming down to you to offer burnt offering and to sacrifice peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait until I come to you and show you what you shall do. Then he turned his back to leave Samuel. When he turned his back to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart. And all these signs came to pass that day. When they came to Gilbath, behold, a group of prophets met him, and the Spirit of God rushed upon him, and he prophesied among them. And when all who knew him previously saw how he prophesied with the prophets, the people said to one another, what has come over the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? And a man of the place answered, and who is their father? Therefore it became a proverb, is Saul also among the prophets? When he had finished prophesying, he came to the high place. Saul's uncle said to him and his servant, where did you go? And he said, to seek the donkeys. And when we saw they were not found, we went to Samuel. And Saul's uncle said, please, tell me what Samuel said to you. And Saul said to his uncle, he told us plainly that the donkeys had been found, but about the matter of the kingdom of which Saul had spoken, he did not tell him anything. This is the word the Lord has for us this morning, and it is eternally true. You can be seated. That is a big, long story. And as I was reading that, you might have been sitting there going, what in the world? Like, what lost donkeys and oil being poured on somebody's head and all of this stuff, okay? So this whole story is really not about Saul. It's not about Israel. It's not about Samuel. This whole story is about God and his sovereignty. It is about God ordaining and being involved in the intimate details of his people and the world that he has made. So there are 5 movements of God's sovereignty in this text, okay? The first one is this: God is absolutely sovereign over all of the affairs of life. God is absolutely sovereign over all the affairs of life. The whole story of this chapter is a story of God working in the small details of life to bring about his extraordinary purposes, which means that there is not one area of the universe over which God has not ordained and is overseeing all of the details. He is absolutely sovereign. He is totally sovereign. There is not one thing in all of creation, in all of existence, that is not under his sovereign decree and power. There are no coincidences that happen in this chapter. Nothing that happens in this chapter is a coincidence. There are divinely ordered and ordained events that transpire. So think of the things that are mentioned that he is sovereign over. Donkeys go missing from Kish. That actual day, right? That morning. Previous to that, God had spoken to Samuel saying, tomorrow there's going to be a guy that you meet. He's going to be looking for some donkeys. This whole ordeal about the donkeys is God acting to bring about his sovereign purposes. Kish, who lost the donkeys, had a son that he sent to find it. The donkeys couldn't be found in Ephraim, Shalzar, Shalem, or anywhere in the land of Benjamin. In other words, it wasn't like they just wandered off that morning and he walked out and, oh, there they are. They're over the next hill. There we go. He went like 20 miles, walking 20 miles outside of the territory and in the direction of Samuel, right? Think about that. You walk outside, go find the donkeys. Now, unless you're some sort of expert tracker, you're probably going to be like, oh, okay, well, there's 360 degrees I can choose from. There's probably a couple of roads. So we'll maybe walk on one of those roads. And he chooses the road that leads down to where Samuel is at. He doesn't walk the other way. And in fact, he keeps on with this. He gets to a point where he is, he's like, well, look, we haven't found the donkeys. Let's go home because my dad's going to be worried about us now. And what did his father say? His father said, bring a servant. He didn't say which servant. He said, bring a servant. And he brought that one servant. And that one servant said, well, hang on a second. I know about a guy in this area named Samuel. And he knows about things. God has appointed him, and everything that he says comes true. So this one servant that Saul brings knows about Samuel. And then Saul's like, well, that's great, but we don't have any money. We don't have anything to give him. We ate all the bread. And that same servant says, well, I've got a quarter of a shekel of silver that we can give him. Here, take my money. So God is ordaining all of these things. So there's the servant that's chosen. There's the fact that the servant has the money on him. The fact that the servant knows about Samuel. The fact that Saul and the servant are moving in the direction of Samuel to begin with, looking for these donkeys for 20 some odd miles. The fact that they meet these women going to draw water who happen to know that Samuel, there's a lot of S names in this whole thing, that Samuel just passed them and is going into town to offer an offering. And they're the ones that say, hurry up, you're going to miss him. Once he goes up to the high priest, you won't be able to catch him. So there's women were divinely appointed to be there at the right moment to keep them on the path, to urge them forward. And the first person they meet in town is Samuel himself. Now, all of these different things, think about all of these different things. Think if just one of them was different. Just one. This whole story would be totally different if just one of these events was different. And the world has terms for this. The world calls it a coincidence. The world calls it fortunate serendipity. They call it fate or fortune or karma or luck. But these words are not in the Christian worldview vocabulary. Instead, Christians understand that there is an all-wise, all-powerful creator of the universe who has not only made all things, but oversees and directs and ordains all things, and all of that according to the purpose of his will, which we see in Ephesians 1:11. So, back to what what the text that Ben mentioned, Romans 12, 28. God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. He is not absent. He is not uninvolved. He doesn't just make everything, get it going, wind it up, and sit back and see what happens. He is intimately involved with all of the details. He knows the beginning from the end because he has ordained it. In Isaiah chapter 46, verse 10, says he is declaring the end from the beginning, from the ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. And Isaiah 41:4, who has performed this and carried it out, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, the first and the last, I am he. In Isaiah 14:24, the Lord of hosts has sworn, surely as I have planned, so it will be. As I have purposed, so it will stand. Of all the things listed, none of them were a coincidence. All of them were divinely appointed. They were divinely orchestrated. And they were divinely orchestrated to fulfill the words given to Samuel. Tomorrow, at about this time, I will send you a man, a Benjaminite. And the fact that God said that to Samuel in advance, and then he has this very personal, I will send, right? We should be putting all these things together and be recognizing that he is absolutely sovereign over everything. So what does this mean for us? Here's the question. Here's the application. Do you believe in the sovereignty of God? Do you really believe in the sovereignty of God? Do you really believe it? I'm not talking about just affirming the verses. Do you believe what they mean? Romans 8:28 loves to be quoted, but I fear that we minimize the word all. We know that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. All things. All things. Do you believe that all? It's very easy to affirm he works some things. He can control some things, but I got my hand on I got my thumb on the other things. It doesn't work like that. Romans 8:28 is a glorious verse because God is absolutely sovereign in Romans 8:28. If he's not absolutely sovereign, he can't work all things together for good. Do we really believe this? He works all things according to the counsel of his will in Ephesians chapter 1. Do we believe the all? Or do we like to nod at the sovereignty of God as long as it doesn't conflict with our own sovereignty? See, we have a problem with this. We tend to want him to be sovereign over the things that we want him to be sovereign over, but not really get involved in the things we don't want him to be sovereign over. We think in our day and age, and this is very interesting, as I was thinking about this, it's so much easier now to not really be all in the sovereignty of God than it ever has in the past. Because we have so much technology and so much advancement, and we think ourselves so clever. Think of how God's sovereignty is talked about in terms of sending rain or not sending rain. Well, who needs that? I've got a pivot and I've got a pump, and I can produce my own rain. I can produce my own water. Right? It's very difficult in our day and age. Well, I'm struggling financially. Well, I can go to a bank and get a loan. I don't need him. See, we like to think of ourselves as if somehow having extended beyond, those are just archaic things. That's stuff that people believed when they didn't really have the science. We know so much more now. The Bible tells a different story. He raises up rulers and nations. He brings them low. Our elections are not ultimate. Maybe a good thing to remember this year. Our elections are not ultimate. It doesn't mean don't vote. We'll get to that in a minute. But it does mean that he is sovereign over all things. He's sovereign over the ruler. He's sovereign over the nations. He causes the rain to fall, and he causes it to stop. Our technological advances aren't ultimate. He makes crops grow, and he causes crops to fail. Our agricultural advances aren't ultimate. He appoints the number of our days, and nothing can extend or prolong them, nor can they be shortened. Our medical knowledge and abilities are not ultimate. The cult of safety is not ultimate. He knits every human being together in the womb, and there are no mistakes. Moses' stutter was intentional. He is down to the details of forming Moses' mouth. That's what he says. Which means that every child born with Down syndrome or any child born with some sort of medical abnormality or deformity is not messed up and is not a mistake, contrary to what our world says, because God is sovereign over those things. We had this out, like Carly and I had this out. There might be a time, you may be surprised, when we were not sure if we were going to have kids. We have since remedied that, but what was one of the number one things, one of the number one barriers was I have a genetic problem with my kidneys, and if we have children, we're going to pass that along. And you know what? You know what changed that? Recognizing and acknowledging and embracing the sovereignty of God and how that coalesces with the dignity of human life. He ordains the seasons. He appoints our abilities, talents, and gifts. He directs history according to his will. Every sickness, every ailment we face is appointed and ordained by God. He is that sovereign. He is that in control. Do you believe that? It's been tested in the last few years, hasn't it? Do we really believe God's sovereignty? Now, this is not saying act stupid. This is not saying jump out of an airplane without a parachute because God has ordained your days, and let's test that theory out. You might just end up a quadriplegic until he's done with you. But it is saying that he is absolutely sovereign over all of the details. And the fact is that it would be terrifying if God were not good and gracious. The fact that he is good, the fact that he is gracious, the fact that he is kind, and the fact that he is in control is a place to rest as a believer because his character is good. Do you realize that all of the promises of God depend on him being absolutely sovereign over everything? He couldn't say to Samuel, tomorrow about this time, I'm going to send you a man, if he wasn't able to deliver. And the same is true for all the rest of his promises. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, because he ordains all of the details of creation, he is sovereignly at work in the mundane details of life. Because he's in control of everything, he's at work through the ordinary, mundane, vanilla things of existence. Isn't it striking how nothing blows you away from this story? What is this story about? If not an agricultural problem, like I've got donkeys and they're missing and I need to find them. All of these things in this story are so vanilla, so mundane, so ordinary. Each of these things, though, are extraordinarily ordinary because they're overseen by God. This doesn't have a story of David and Goliath and some sort of big drama there. There's no big crescendo where there's a transfiguration moment. This is just ordinary, everyday life. And God is in the midst of all of these boring, vanilla Tuesday afternoon things. He's at work because he's absolutely sovereign over everything. In the midst of this boring, mundane, vanilla Tuesday, it wasn't necessarily a Tuesday. I'm just making that up because we can relate to that maybe a little bit more. Tuesday is kind of like a day, at least for me. So in the middle of this boring, vanilla Tuesday, think of all the ways that God is at work in ordinary things. All of the ways. Now, we might be thinking, oh, well, there's the servant that has the silver in his pocket, and he knows about Samuel. And yes, that would be true. But think of all the things that had to happen for those women to have the information that they had and be at that place in that moment and willing to talk to these two men. In a culture where women don't talk to men that are not their husbands, right? In a culture where men don't talk to women that aren't their wives. Like, think of all of the ordinary things. And how all of those things, in all of those things, God is working to bring about his extraordinary purposes. And it's not some massive thing. It's ordinary. Stephen Charnock, who was a Puritan in the 1600s, wrote this, quote, God works through small means to implement his extraordinary providence. The most significant events in the world usually have exceedingly small beginnings. From a few letters, thousands of words are made. From 10 figures, thousands of numbers. A point is the beginning of all geometry. A little stone flung into a pond makes a little circle, and then greater, till it is large enough to reach both sides. So from small beginnings, God initiates a flow through the whole world. He goes on to say that, quote, God uses small means in his ordinary work. Mighty trees are formed from small seeds. Who would imagine that Saul, in sinking his father's donkeys, would find a kingdom? So here's the application for us. How do we view the ordinary events, disappointments, frustrations, and realities of life? Are we looking for how he is at work, or are we obsessed with our inconvenience or frustration? Are we lulled into passivity by the boring, ordinary, vanilla, everyday stuff? Or are we looking for him to be active and involved in it? Are we expecting him to be active and involved in it? Are you looking for him to make you more like Christ and for you to depend on him more in those mundane, ordinary moments of life? And I ask this, and this is the application of this, because so many Christians think that Christianity is a series of watershed moments, massive moments, memorable experiences, big mountaintop things. It's like Mount of Transfiguration moments. And the truth is, that isn't it at all. The Christian life is mostly mundane, boring, monotonous, ordinary things that God is at work in. So many people think that God isn't at work because they think he only works in these big, massive moments. And so what happens is we tend to do things to manufacture them. C.S. Lewis calls this chasing an oddcore, right? Chasing a thrill. We're constantly after the next thing that will move us, the next thing that will convince us that God's active and at work so we can feel like something's happening. And if there's not this big thing and everything is ordinary and bland and vanilla and mundane, we feel like he's somehow not working. And so we try to make everything bigger and better. If it doesn't rock our world and it doesn't have significance, and many people chase that week after week and end up missing the awe of God working in the ordinary. It's much of what the American church is built around, a series of big, moving, memorable, entertaining experiences. But that just leads us to chase a spiritual high, and that's not the Christian life. God works through mundane, seemingly insignificant moments in life. Small things, the late for work kind of things, the I don't know how to react when my spouse is offended or hurt me type of things, the I've said this to my child 50,000 times kind of things. And we all experience it. Ordinary days, ordinary weeks, ordinary months, and we are tempted to think God must not be at work right now because this is so ordinary. What could he possibly be doing? There's another side of that coin too, because we get into a series of frustrations, or we go through what we might call a spiritual slump, like right in baseball. There's this phenomenon where people that could hit all of a sudden can't hit, and they can't figure out why. And they go through a slump where their batting average is terrible for a season or 2 seasons, or until they get cut, or something snaps and they figure it out, right? So we have these spiritual slumps that we go through, these seasons. Have you ever noticed how life tends to work in seasons of sort of like ebbs and flows? Like you'll go through a series of events where you're like, oh my gosh, this is so frustrating. What else could happen right now? And then something does. And you're like, oh my gosh, what else could happen right now? And something does, right? You get through into those rhythms. You have the tight month financially with unexpected costs, and the car breaks down, and then everybody in the family gets sick, and you have no more sick days for work. And on top of that, you're starting to get testy with each other and starting to feel the frustration, and you're thinking, why isn't God at work? I would submit to you that he is, and you just aren't seeing it, because what we are looking for is not how he's at work in the frustrations, because we think he's only at work when we're not frustrated. We can't see it because we aren't looking to him, but to ourselves and our own frustrations. So I wasn't thinking, I wonder what God is up to in this, as he was walking along. In fact, he gets to a point where he's like, all right, look, we haven't found him. Let's go home. Dad's going to be concerned about us. right? Here's my translation of that. This is conjecture, but I hope we find that stupid donkey pretty soon because I'm sick of looking for it. This nonsense needs to be over, right? That's the John Standard version. Yet, it was through all of this ordinary stuff and what we call boring and even frustrating things that God is working. So given that truth, how do you view the mundane events, the ordinary disappointments, even the frustrations of life? Do you see them as God at work, sanctifying you, advancing his kingdom, building you up for his glory? Or do you view them in some light that prevents you from trusting God is sovereignly at work in those things? He's always working through these things to build you up and to change you. And just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. And that means, it leads us to the next one, that in those mundane, ordinary, boring things, God is working sovereignly for the good of his people. In chapter 9, verses 16 to 17, Samuel gets told that this guy that he's to anoint is going to save Israel from their enemies. He's going to save them from the Philistines, and he's going to restrain them. In chapter 10, verse 1, we see then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, "Has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies." God had really good purposes for his people in these divinely ordained moments. And through working in these ordinary things, he's bringing about extraordinary things for his people and grace and goodness for his people. Notice two things that he says, that Saul will deliver God's people from his enemies and he will restrain them. So they ask for a ruler like the other nations. And God, in one sense, grants their request. Saul is extremely handsome. We're told that over and over again. No one more handsome than he. He's literally head and shoulders over everybody else. He's a tall, big, impressive dude. He's also, if you keep reading, a disaster of a ruler. Right? His reign, his rule does not end well. Things are bad. And yet, God is going to use him to bring about his purposes, to secure his people, and to restrain them. It's fascinating to me. This is grace to his people, and it's important to see that God sovereignly always works for the good of his people and the glory of his name. That's the thrust of Romans 8:28. So the application of this is, do you believe and do you live with a deep and abiding confidence that God is for his people and his sovereign purposes are always good? Now, this means both individually and collectively. Do you believe that his sovereign purposes are always good for you as a believer and good for his people as a whole? Do you live in light of that? Because not one of his children goes unnoticed. He doesn't lose track. Have you ever lost one of your kids? He doesn't. Like, I know some of you have. It's not a hint of judgment because I know we've done it too. You walk away like we think we got everybody. Oh, nope, we're missing one when you do the count in the car or whatever. God doesn't work like that. Not one of his children goes missing. He is always at work for our good as individuals and for our good as his people. And both of those are for his glory. Those two don't contradict. Our good and his glory don't contradict. They're the same thing. So this week I was talking to somebody who's a member of the church here, and was telling me about a medical situation that came up. And the way that this whole thing went down, it was a breathing issue. It was and the specialist that normally was at York on Monday came on Wednesday because tomorrow is a holiday, and decided to see patients. And because of that, this person was able to get a procedure that was needed that only the specialist could do. Okay? Now, that guy had a very clever, very rational, very practical idea. Like, I'm still going to, see some patients. He might not have even known that he probably didn't. And yet, God was working to bring about that specific purpose for the good of his child in that moment. Kidney failure was one of the best things that ever happened to me. One of the best things that ever happened to me. Right? Not a bad thing, totally good thing. painful at times, inconvenience, yes, absolutely, all those things, but ultimately good. Because God was working in that for the good of me as his child, to actually even bring me to himself. But he's also working for the good of his people as a whole. And so God's sovereignty works for the good of his people and for the glory of his name. He sends Saul to protect the people and restrain the people because God cares about his people, even though Saul's going to be a disaster. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a second. Number 4, God is at work in his sovereignty to provide what is needed to accomplish his purpose. In chapter 10, verses 6 to 7, the Spirit falls upon Saul. Saul is to act under the influence of the Spirit. Now, this is not saying that Saul is saved. There's a lot of debate about this, right? In the Old Testament, the Spirit came upon a person to equip them to do what God had called them to do. In the New Testament, all who are truly believers, all who have been born again, have the Spirit indwelling them. Why? Well, to, in part, equip us to do what he has called us to do. God provides sovereignly what we need to do when he calls us to do something. And that's the obvious way, it's the Holy Spirit. But think about the less obvious way here. The servant. Saul's not exactly the spiritual leader in this situation. He's not the most spiritually astute person, and yet he has this servant that God provided, that brought him, that God appointed to come along with him, that knew who Samuel was, who knew where Samuel was, knew Samuel's reputation, and happened to have and was willing to part with the money to be able to make this happen. So God used an external means to provide for Saul what was needed for him to accomplish what God was calling him to accomplish. And so, in verse 9, we see this amazing verse. God gave him another heart. God supernaturally wrought a change in him to enable him to do what God had ordained him to do. So here's the application. Are you relying on your wisdom, ability, and strength, or upon God's? Right? We can be like, okay, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to do it. Me. I can do it on my own. I can do it my way. Do you rely upon the Spirit, or is he a last resort, a kind of nuisance who pokes at you when you're wrong, when you really want to think you're right? We've all experienced that, right? We've all gotten to that point. Like, will you just be quiet? I do not want to deal with this right now. I'm perfectly happy going this direction, though I know it's wrong. Thank you very much. And yet, God provides what we need. Do we bring our requests to the Lord? Do we seek to yield to his Spirit? Or are we pretty much wise on our own and God's there as a backup, hip pocket, things get bad, I'll turn to him? Are we leaning into godly people that he has placed around us that will influence us and be influences of his grace in our life? Or are we perfectly happy coming up with our own solutions on our own and ignoring the common grace that God has given around us? You see all the ways that God is providing what is needed for us to do what he has called us to do, and are we leaning into them, or are we making excuses depending on ourselves apart from him? So let's go with something easy. God says, let the word of Christ dwell in us richly. We're to saturate our minds with Scripture. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So we all have a Bible. If you don't, you can download it on your phone for free, right? No excuse there. We all, if you're a believer, have the Spirit, and we have other believers to help us accomplish this. And how easy do we find it to make excuses of, I can't? I can't understand what this means. Well, perhaps we're not availing ourselves of the means that God has given in order to equip us to accomplish that which he has called us to. Perhaps we don't begin with asking God for understanding. Perhaps we look at this as an academic exercise where we can figure this out on our own grammatically alone. Perhaps we don't lean into the people around us that are wiser than us or that might have an insight that will help us. And rather than leaning into these things, we make excuses. The same thing can be said for parenting and discipling our children. I'm no expert. No, but you're the parent that God has sovereignly appointed to be head over that child. Well, I don't know what I'm doing. Well, guess what? He's given you the Spirit. He's given you other believers. He's given you pastors, shepherds, elders. You have everything you need. Do we believe he's sovereign like that? Do we believe, even when we feel like we are not equipped, that he has given us everything we need to do what he has called us to do? So I can't stand here and tell you that you're going to meet two men later that'll have some bread. But I can tell you that God says, don't be anxious about anything in Matthew chapter 6. I can tell you that he says, don't let your hearts be troubled in John 14:27. I can tell you that God of peace himself will sanctify you completely, and that your whole spirit and body will be kept blameless at the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he who calls you is faithful, and he will surely do it in 1 Thessalonians 5. Do we trust he's providing even when we feel stuck? And do we go back to what we know as we wait for him to show us what we don't know? Do we trust that God will sovereignly provide what is needed when it's needed to do what he has called us to do? Final point this morning. God is at work in his sovereignty on a grand scope beyond all that we can see, anticipate, or imagine. Saul is a means to David, and David is a means to Christ. This text has echoes that reverberate until Christ comes as the substance. Saul is anointed privately. He becomes the anointed king to save and restrain his people. Now we know how this ends. He's not a hero. He's not the point. In fact, it's debatable as to whether or not he's even truly saved. What is important to see is that God anoints him to do a task, but also he is a means to get to David. And then we have David, a man after God's own heart, and he's not the hero. What's the point or goal of him? He's actually the first of many kings that God has promised that will rule and reign, some of them good, some of them bad, but all of them anticipating the true son of David, the one who would take up the throne of David for all eternity, who would reign and rule in perfect, glorious righteousness forever, who would establish the throne of David in the kingdom of his father, never to be thwarted, never to be uprooted, and forever to be established. In some ways, he's the anti-Saul. He doesn't have beauty that we would look at him and desire him. He's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He's not impressive from a worldly standpoint. And yet he reigns and rules in righteousness. And he is after the ultimate good and deliverance of his people. So here's the application for this. Is our focus too narrow, and is our faith too small? We know what the end is. We know how this all ends. We know that in this life we'll have troubles, but Christ has overcome. And one day we'll be with him for eternity in fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore, without pain or sorrow or sin, and all of the wrongs will be made right. We know all of that. And yet we get fixated on these tiny little moments and these slight momentary afflictions that are preparing us for an eternal way to glory, that we convince ourselves are so heavy and so disruptive that they cannot possibly be doing any good at all whatsoever in our lives. They are lasting and meaningless in our minds because we don't have the right perspective. Our focus is too narrow. We're focused on ourselves in this moment rather than eternity. And in addition, our faith is often too small. We struggle to trust God when the smallest little hiccup to our plans pops up. Perhaps that's why we tend to live trusting in ourselves and not him, because it's pretty easy in America to do that. We are the people who say, tomorrow I'll go to such and such a place and stay for a while and make some money, when we should say, if the Lord wills, in James chapter 4, verses 13 to 15. And the slightest interruption in our plan seems to just derail our faith because we're not trusting in a sovereign God like that. Our focus is too narrow and our faith is too small. We need a larger, more God-like focus. We need a larger, more God-centered trust. And those don't come unless we embrace the absolute sovereignty of God who brought Saul to the throne to get David, to get Christ, who is the point of all things. And the same God that sent his Son to establish his kingdom and who reigns and rules over creation will surely bring to pass all of his promises that he has appointed because he is the sovereign king. He is reigning. And when we trust God like that, when we focus not only on what he has promised, but where he is leading us, and more than that, who is actually the one that is leading us and keeping us and protecting us, namely Christ, we will live differently now. So how do you view God's sovereignty? Do you see it as absolute? Do you see him as being at work in the monotony of life? Do you see him as bringing about only good for his people? Do you see him as working to equip us with everything we need to do what he has called us to? And do we see that he is sovereignly working toward this great and glorious future that we can anticipate and hope in and look forward to, that keeps us from getting stuck in the ordinary things that might otherwise discourage and derail us? How big is your God? Let's pray.